Hello, I'm Jennifer Stowell. Idea to IPO has been holding tech startup events in Silicon Valley for many, many years. We launched officially on February 1st, 2010. At that time, we had no members and no events on our calendar. At this stage, we have over 100,000 members among all of our meetup groups all around the world. And we've organized, promoted, and produced over 2,495 events. By any standard, by any measure, we are the most active, most prolific startup event organization in the history of Silicon Valley, bar none. We organize venture capital panels, legal workshops, networking events, and more. These days, we are 100% online. We hold an event nearly every day of the week. Check out our schedule at www.idea2ipo.com. Our featured speaker today is Jason Putnam Gordon, one of the top venture capital attorneys in Silicon Valley, and he is passionate about helping entrepreneurs succeed. Ladies and gentlemen, Jason Putnam Gordon. Jason, take it away.
Jason, you're muted.
There we go. Thank you, Rob. Let's start again. Good evening. This is Jason Gordon. It's wonderful to be here tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. Doing how to position your startup for venture capital funding. Tonight, I'm very excited. We're going to move through a bunch of content, but before we do, I want to provide you with an overview of of how tonight's going to run. So, first thing we're going to do is tonight's event is recorded. So if you've missed some or all of it, don't worry. So long as you have provided us and registered, provides your email address and your registration, we'll get you a copy of it. So don't worry about that. The other thing is that I will speak for about an hour. We'll talk about how to position your startup for a venture capital funding. And during that, if you have questions, please use the Q&A. If you use the chat function, I'll try and monitor it. But in addition to providing the content tonight, I'm also running most of the back end, which maybe accounts for the snafu on the mute button. Sorry about that. Anyway, got a question, send in the Q&A. I'll see if it's sort of relevant to this topic, whatever the content we're moving through. And if it is, I'll try and answer it. If not, we might save it towards the end. Hopefully we'll get through all the questions. Again, I'll speak for about an hour. We'll then answer any additional questions in the following 30 minutes. So I think with that in mind, we can jump into today's presentation. So, important caveats. Today's discussion is about general information. It is not legal advice, okay? The things and the topics that we're going to be talking about imply a lot of rules, a lot of facts. There are a lot of exceptions to the rules. If you provide me with some content, even if some of your questions and some information about it, even if I answer your question, it's not really designed to be specific legal advice for you because there's more information I would uncover if you had retained me and we had done some work together. So again, doesn't matter if we speak, if you ask your question tonight or we speak in the future, it is general information on how these things usually go. Now, background, and while I sort of tell you a little bit of background about myself, I want to also share with you, I want to learn about you. So I'm launching a poll right now. So while I'm filling this out, if you could review the poll, it'll help me get a sense for who's in the room. So we'll go over my background. We'll learn about your background. We'll talk about the structural considerations for setting your company up and getting you set up with the venture capital funding. We'll talk about how to, as part of that, the documentation for founders and early employees. We'll talk about the funding mechanisms and the funding stages. We'll talk about convertible debt and safes, which are some of some critical funding mechanisms for early stage companies. We'll talk about valuation and dilution, and then we'll also talk about venture financings. So again, tonight's conversation is really geared to those companies that intend to be venture backed. What is a venture backed company? Well, that's one that's raising venture capital. But the reason why they are raising venture capital is not because venture capital is a means in and of itself, but rather those companies need a tremendous amount of capital to grow and scale quickly. That should take place over, sort of a 7 to 10 year period. And it's a very specific kind of beast. We're not going to be going into the nuts and bolts of how you would negotiate a venture funding at this point, because that's a different topic. We're also going to kind of stay a little bit at a high level as it relates to seed financings that are, those are the safes and the convertible notes, which I mentioned a few moments ago. And the reason for that is that's also a different topic. So we're going to move through a lot of ground all the way from the very beginning up into the financing. And we're going to do that in about an hour. Okay, so who am I? So I'm a venture capital and emerging growth company attorney. I've been practicing law since 2005. I'm originally from the East Coast, moved out here in 2007. I'm with Pulcinelli, LLP. Pulcinelli is an Am Law 100 firm with over 900 attorneys in roughly 20 different offices. I work with companies throughout the Bay Area, throughout the US, and throughout the world, especially being here in the Bay Area because I'm here in San Francisco. We get a lot of inbound companies that are started elsewhere. They're seeing success elsewhere. They're interested in coming to the United States market, especially if they're in tech, venture. They frequently end up here. And I love working with entrepreneurs and executives on financings, mergers and acquisitions, and as outside general counsel. I've got a little bit of an entrepreneurial bug myself. Before I ended up at this large firm, I ran my own little boutique firm for 6 years doing what it is that I'm doing today. And I just love it. All right, so let's kind of go through here and highlight some of the responses in the audience survey. Not a surprise. What we see is about 55% of the room is a first-time entrepreneur. We've got 15% are repeat players. We've got 11% in the angel investor category. We've got 3% in the VC, either a corporate VC or they're with a fund. We've got some folks at mature companies and a couple students. So we've got a good mix, kind of the mix that I would expect with this topic. And I'm gonna see, where is everyone? Okay, so we've got probably 25% or so in the Bay Area, with another, in the aggregate, 40% in California, a total of 60% in the US, some folks from either Canada or Mexico, and then a couple, 10% from Asia and Australia, and a couple percentage points from Europe and Africa. Exciting. I'm glad that you're all here with me tonight. Let's keep moving through this content. Again, if you've got questions, use the Q&A function. I'll try and address them, especially if it's particularly on point. All right, I always like to start these, especially when we've got a room with sort of 50% or so first-time entrepreneurs, of making sure you understand what the big picture is. And we're gonna do that sort of in two pieces. One, the way that I sort of visualize this is that the company is this small building here that you can see. And there are a bunch of inputs. And from a legal perspective, what we want to do is we want to tie each of those inputs into the company so that over time, when those inputs get in there, time passes, the company increases in value. And that's sort of represented here. You can check this out. This is a great little figure demonstrating the life cycle for a typical venture-backed company. So you start out very early stage, okay? That's when their first funding is from angels, to get your initial team together, to get your initial prototype together, maybe start to get out in the market, sort of beta test it a little bit. And that takes you all the way up to sort of this first blue line. Before you get to that blue line, you're probably doing seed funding, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the program. Then after that, you start to get into these venture rounds, with first really being the A, second being the B, third being the C, and so on and so forth. And in those points in time, what you're going to see is, revenue go from being negative, hopefully, to starting to grow and to start to have an income. Okay. And it has a sharp uptick before it flattens out, which is maturing. And then will have an exit. You may have an exit earlier, you may have an exit later. The typical goal is for an IPO. But the reality of it is that even a very, very successful companies, most exits are through an M&A event. Now, that explains the diagram. Let's just chat about some structural considerations. Usually what we're going to see get set up is a Delaware C-Corp. Now, the analysis that we run for these types of companies is the same as if anybody walked into my office and told me they wanted to set up a company. And in fact, even when someone comes in and says that they want to do a venture-backed startup, I still run the analysis because, especially if they're first-time entrepreneurs, they may not really know what that means or entails. And some folks make the mistake of thinking that it's a means that raising venture capital is an end in and of itself. It's not. It's a means it is capital to get you to where you need to go. And it gets dispersed over time, as you see in that sort of first, second, third, and subsequent lines. Now, the analysis we run is we take a look at the liability exposure that the participants would have, that is, the entrepreneurs would have. We take a look at the tax structure. We take a look at the management structure that needs to get in place. That is, who over the life cycle of the company is going to need to have input on management. And we'll talk a little bit about that later when we talk about board seats. We'll talk about the capital raising requirements of the company. And that's really what drives it. Who are your investors and what are they going to want to get? And then we'll talk about, how is it that you want to issue equity, or will you be issuing equity to service providers, to consultants and employees? And then we talk about your contemplated exit. So all in all, it's usually the investors that drive it to a C-Corp, and that has to do with the way that their own funds are set up. And then it's usually also a Delaware corporation for a host of reasons, which include Delaware has some of the best corporate law in the land. It has some of the most, generally speaking, has some of the most robust protections for directors and officers. That's important because if and when you raise venture capital, likely there'll be one of the venture capitalists will be able to appoint somebody to your board. And so they're going to have robust protections in place there. And then there's good case law. There's a court that is dedicated to business disputes, the Delaware Chancery. That helps for good case law in order to resolve issues. And then the Secretary of State's office in Delaware is awesome. All right. So let's move into some of the nuts and bolts or things that you need to think about. So we were talking about inputs in my little building diagram, right? And so what we want to see is all of the intellectual property that is necessary to carry out the planned business needs to get into the company. So that means IP assignments need to get in place. These are some of the things that you must get in place with the founders and early employees, so that you don't end up with a company that is going to be dead on arrival, or you're going to have to spend an inordinate amount of time and money trying to fix it. IP is one of the most important things that a startup has. It needs to get locked down. And at founders who want to try and retain some IP via a license, usually does not work out well. There needs to be a legitimate business reason why the company won't have the exclusive right to use that IP. And certainly, at least in any capacity that's going to be germane to the business. Vesting. Now, I always sort of think as vesting as there's a common misconception about vesting. Most people who are not familiar with vesting think about vesting as getting shares of stock over time for time served or upon accomplishments of certain metrics or milestones. That's not what vesting is, or that's not what we mean when we're talking about. In this context, actually, vesting is more like this. Vesting is more like having all of your shares getting issued up front, but those shares were going to have strings to them. And as you move through time, the strings on the shares will get cut. And so if you depart, you will walk away with the shares for which the strings have been cut. I think that's a better way to look at it. Now, typically that's going to be for a 4-year period with a 1-year cliff. Double trigger acceleration, which means 2 events need to happen. Usually the termination of the person within a period of time and a change of control event. That is, the company gets acquired, or there's a sale of the assets or something along those lines, where basically the management and ownership structure changes in the company. Now, one of the other big goofs that happens along the way, especially if you're not represented by appropriate counsel, if you do get vesting set up in place, you're going to want to make sure that you get you will almost always want to make sure you get an 83B election. An 83B election is a tax election that basically says, let's go back to that sort of visual image of having all of your shares up front with strings attached to them. So the IRS takes the position that you don't actually get those shares until the strings have been cut. Okay, well, why do you care about that? Well, the reality of it is if you get all those shares up front and you pay a very small amount of money, over the 1, 2, 3, 4+ years of time, the shares are going to increase in value, or at least that's the goal. And if they increase in value and you don't receive them until the string gets cut from the IRS's perspective, then you're going to owe tax on the difference between what you paid for them, which is pretty close to nothing, and what they're valued at the time the string was cut. 83B election is a way to accelerate that. So you pay all the tax when you initially get the stock. And so when the string gets cut, you don't end up with a surprise tax bill. Now, let's say you don't get some of this stuff in place at the outset. May or may not be a deal killer. It depends who's involved, what the dynamics are, if you get along with your co-founders and early employees. If you don't get vesting in place right away, you're going to have to get it in place before the VCs will put their money in. That's going to be part of the term sheet. And even if you've got investing in place, if you have spent enough time in the company so that most of the vesting restrictions have lapsed, they'll make you put them back in place. Now, some of the other really important things to get in place with early stage, with founders and early employees are various kinds of transfer restrictions. So those are restrictions in the company's bylaws or the restricted stock purchase agreement, or sometimes they're in other shareholder agreements that prevent the owners of the stock from transferring or assigning or giving away or selling that stock to somebody else, usually without the company having a right of first refusal. That is, the company has the right to buy those shares back first. Now, there are exceptions for estate planning purposes and things like that, but usually, well, not usually, you're going to need to get those things in place. The reason is to manage the cap table. If we go back to that really early picture where we're thinking about that building that's going to grow, it's making sure that the relationship of the owners, that's the stockholders, are tied into the company. And it's important to be able to control, have some reasonable control over the cap table for a number of reasons. But just to make it the most concrete one is, you wouldn't want somebody who was upset when they left selling those shares to the competitor. So now the competitor's got an interest in your company. There are a bunch of other reasons aside from that, but I think that's a great concrete one. So glad my mic is on. If you're just come in, you missed that I unfortunately had my mic muted when we started this. But what I wanted to do is just make a quick little side comment that if you've got questions, please use the Q&A function. It's the easiest way for me to track them. Otherwise, I got too many windows up, and I apologize. I might miss some of that. I'm going to take a pause here, and then we'll continue. All right. So thinking back to that diagram at the beginning where we had this sort of life cycle where the first period of time, sort of the valley of death, is the seed funding where you're building your initial team, you're getting together your initial prototypes, maybe starting to test out the market, figure out where you can play in the market and be successful. Let's talk about what your options usually are for funding. So if you're raising $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, maybe even up to $5 million out here, typically that'll get done via a convertible note or a SAFE. It's convertible equity is a SAFE. Convertible notes are also known as bridge notes. Convertible notes and safes are, kissing cousins, if you will. The only real difference between a convertible note and a safe is the fact that the safe doesn't have the debt feature. So it doesn't have a maturity date. That is the date by which you need to pay back this money. And it doesn't have an interest rate. Other than that, by and large, they're the same. That being said, there's not really a standard. And even with safes, although Y Combinator puts them out and does to that extent standardize them, people make changes and alterations all the time. So you really got to read the fine print on these things. Now, sometimes, as you get up to the $2, $3, $4 million mark, you might do some sort of price round, and that'd be a Series Seed round or a small Series A round. And typically that would be a venture financing. It might be a slimmed down version, so it'd have fewer of the bells and whistles that would be in a regular sort of Series A round as we traditionally think of it. But that also sort of lives in this space. So typically, at least out here, and this varies across the United States and it varies across the world, you're raising $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, you're talking about a convertible note or convertible equity. Convertible equity is better known as a safe. So let's talk about some of the features in some of these things. And just to remind everybody, because I'm getting some comments in. If you've missed some or all of this, don't worry. It's being recorded. You'll get a copy of this probably in about a week or so if you've registered, which if you're here, you probably have registered. So convertible notes, let's take those first and foremost. Those are the ones with the asterisks right next to them. Maturity date. That's the date that you got to pay the note back. Let's make that a little bit more concrete. Maybe you have bought a car with a car note or a house with a mortgage. Those usually there's payment over time. There's not a really balloon payment, but the way that the convertible notes are set up is, usually it's one payment, principal and interest all the way at the end. Boom, that's it. That's the maturity date, the date that it's due. The other factor in there is the interest rate. And we'll talk about these things in a second. We'll go into a little bit more depth. It'll also have the conversion terms because, sort of the reasons, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but the reasons why these instruments are used earlier on is severalfold. One, valuing early stage companies is extremely difficult. Even Series A stage companies, nobody really knows what that founder and what that initial team, that initial technology is going to do or really be worth. They don't know what that market's going to be worth. And so it's tricky. So what these two instruments do is they allow you to sort of delay that. People get their money in early, usually for a discount. And we'll talk about discounts and caps in a second. Amendment provisions are pretty critical. Okay, what we usually like to see is that the holders of a majority in interest, that is for a convertible note, let's say, the outstanding principal. So whoever, if there are $1 million worth of convertible notes issued, it's the people necessary to have the principal add up to $500,000, just over $500,000. At least if you're company side, that's important because if you bump up against that maturity date or there's some other term that needs to be changed, you need to have a mechanism to get a consensus and have everybody get treated basically sort of the same and make that change. Otherwise, you can end up with folks who have, otherwise you got to do an amendment with each of the note holders or each of the safe holders. And someone can hold you up and has some leverage if they want to kind of strike out a better deal. Now, the remaining terms are not super duper common to negotiate, but you do need to make sure that you go through those documents. Your attorney goes through those documents to know if there's something strange out of the ordinary with them. So conversion terms are kind of where the rubber meets the road, if you will. It's the terms by which that money that the investor has put into the company turns into preferred stock once there's a preferred stock financing. What is a preferred stock financing? Well, it's what you define it to be. But usually, we're looking at something that says something along the lines of it's an equity financing or a preferred stock financing with a minimum size, usually $1 million, $2 million, $3 million or so. And then and the point of that is so that the investors have some comfort that you're not going to have your buddy come in with a crazy valuation saying your company is worth $100 million and you convert them over for a pittance. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense for them. A pittance in terms of equity, the slice of equity. Now, what's the incentive for these people to put their money in the company? Well, one, hopefully they believe in you and the technology that you're developing. And hopefully you, one, believe in yourself, and also two, are in a position to give it a shot and make a worthwhile run at it. And then of course, two, they're getting incentivized by getting a discount. So they basically, if they put in like, let's say the preferred stock comes in at $1 a share, you know, their money rolls over at 85 cents a share into the share. Now there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we go into in the convertible note financing series or the session we're not going to talk about here, but that's the point. And then the conversion price cap is a way to juice that, so that if the company actually fares far better with the money that gets put into the company, then there's basically going to be a much larger discount. So that's what the point of the cap is. People sometimes think about the cap being a valuation. It's not really, it's not a valuation in the sense that nobody's actually saying that's what the value of your company is. It's really saying, you know, in the future, if it turns out that that value is greater than something else, I'm going to get juiced up or boost up beyond the typical discount. Now, that being said, you can have notes with no discount. You can have notes with no cap. You can have notes with both a cap and a discount. You can also have most favored nation clauses and notes. There's all kinds of different ways you can cut these. But those are the two most common things. You also see that there'll be conversion upon a change of control or a sale of the company, basically. And that's a way so that the investors can get their money, not just get their money back, but they'll probably get the greater of some liquidation preference, which might be, you know, sort of 1, 2, or 3x, or the value if they convert it over to common. And from time to time, we also see that the investors will have the right to convert into some other type of equity, whether it's common or preferred, if the maturity date gets hit before the preferred round actually comes in. Okie dokie. I'm going to just take a quick pause here, take a look at the Q&A, give folks a moment to digest that, and see if we've got anything else coming on. All right. There's one question I'll save to the end. Save the pros and cons of starting a California company as opposed to a Delaware company. Well, I think the biggest one, and this is a theme, you know, one, setting your company up to be a venture-backed company is not the right move for every company. Okay. So I do think, you know, as I said at the outset, we do the analysis anytime anybody walks in the door, even if we think we know what the outcome is going to be, because in the course of doing that analysis and asking some questions, we sometimes come to the conclusion that, oh, you know what? I really thought this was going to be a venture-backed company, but really only need to raise like $1 million or $2 million in total in order to build and scale this thing. In which case you're set up, you know, the money, the investors to whom you would go with such an idea is different. They have different needs. You don't need to set them up that way. Now, going through that analysis, if you come to the conclusion that you're going to want to have, it's appropriate for you to have a company that's going to be or get set up to be venture-backed, then the real con with using a California corporation is that most likely you're going to need to merge it out and over to a Delaware corporation later, and in which case, depending upon the timing of when you do that, it can be costly and expensive. So, you know, I'm in California. I love working with California corporations. I got clients that are California corporations. But the real con is, you know, and it's just sort of a theory, not theory. It is a guiding principle is, you know, if you've got a sense for where you want to go, you know, work backwards and get the things in place that are going to get you there. Don't get yourself started with something that isn't, you know, isn't going to get you on the path. Now, that being said, many times, if you've got yourself set up with an LLC or you've got yourself set up with a corporation that's not the right state, not the end of the world. There are things we can do to fix that, and it is possible you could convince the investor that is the right mechanism, but there are some reasons they don't like that, which include the fact that usually under the California code, if you're going to do a merger or some sort of other exit, frequently the common will get its own vote. And so there's a concern that, as opposed to just the majority of the stockholders in the aggregate, in which case the preferred is concerned that they may want an exit and they can't get the common vote on board to get it and to make it happen. So that's kind of the most common driving reason not to have that. I was considering filing for an S-Corp Delaware. Are the rules basically the same? S-Corps don't work for venture investors for a host of reasons. Also, which include the number of stockholders, the limit to the number of stockholders that you can have, and also that it's a pass-through entity, and the venture investors are pass-through entities themselves. The funds are set up as LPs, so they have to have a blocker in there. It just doesn't work. Pre-safe versus post-safe. That's kind of on topic. That's a great question, one that I've been wrestling again with. So I presume what this person's asking about a pre-money safe versus a post-money safe. And what the hell does that mean? I'm sure some folks are saying, well, prior to about September or October of 2018, the safes, the conversion mechanisms in the safe was built around the pre-money valuation that comes in for the preferred stock. In September or October of 2018, it changed. So you basically look at all of the safes that come in, and they call that a post-money safe, and that's how they get the denominator when they're taking a look at the conversion mechanism. Now, a little bit later, we'll talk about math and dilution. Now's not the time to really go into it, but suffice it to say, the investors usually like post-money safes a little bit better because it gives them a better sense for what the percentage of the company that they're going to acquire. Company side, I think it's still a little bit better to be on a pre-money safe. That being said, the real rule here, and we'll talk about this more later, is that it's imperative that you build pro forma cap tables and you model out what you're doing in your rounds, even from the very beginning. Now, probably a lot of that is going to be Greek to you, or Latin for pro forma. But basically, it's building Excel spreadsheet models, or using Carta's modeling function if you're in Carta, or outsourcing it to an outside CFO to look to track your cap table. That is, who's got shares, who's got options, what's the size of the option pool, what kind of safes and convertible notes you got out there, and what they would convert into under certain circumstances. That is, the VCs come in and you strike a deal on your term sheet, you've got a $20 million valuation, pre and post, and model it out for this round and next round. Once you do that, pre, post, it's just a math exercise. So you just need to be up to speed on that. By and large, it's a math exercise. Common versus preferred stock. Common stock has basically two rights. It's the right to elect the directors and the right to dividends. If the company's in a position to pay dividends, companies are not going to be in the position to pay dividends first 5-7 years of their life cycle and beyond. I think Microsoft may never have, certainly didn't pay dividends for like the first 20 years or so. That was the example we used to always use, but I think they did start paying dividends. Preferred stock means that they have preferences. These are bells and whistles that common don't have. They stand it, so if the company were to get liquidated, that is in a sale or some other event, they stand in front of the common stockholders to get paid. That's their liquidation preference. It could be the money they put in, it could be 2x the money they put in, it could be something else. They may have special voting rights. They may have rights to elect certain directors. They may have rights to block certain corporate things like corporate transactions, like mergers or acquisitions, inside deals, to the extent the CEO's compensation is getting changed, something along those lines. That's the difference between, at a high level, that's the difference between common and preferred. Venture capitalists want the preferred because they need those bells and whistles to monitor and influence the outcome of their investment towards the better. How many shares should a new startup issue? I'm not going to answer that question other than to say usually what gets authorized is either 10 or 20 million shares. How many should get issued really is going to depend upon who's there, who's involved, what their relative roles are. So it's too hard to answer in this. All right, I'm going to just zoom on back to convertible securities so we can keep flying through this, and then we'll come back to some other questions if we've got them. All right. All right, so why do you use convertible securities? Upside. It's usually simpler, less expensive on the legal spend to put these instruments in place. There's no valuation of the company, which is nearly impossible to do at this stage, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier. The other thing, and that's a typo, which I'll fix, it'll help justify a low fair market value for stock options or restricted stock. So that is when you're awarding early stage or early employees with either restricted stock, that is stock that's subject to vesting, or options, you don't want them to necessarily have to pay a lot of money for it. So because the valuation process is getting kicked down the road, it's sort of easier to take a stake in the ground that it's a lower number. Downsides, at least for convertible notes, it is debt, okay, which means that it needs to get repaid at some point, which means that at some point in the future, as you roll up on the maturity date, depending upon how that note is put together, you may need to pay the investors back right away. That potentially creates some leverage on their behalf for them to extract sort of different or better deals, whether that is changing the discount, changing the caps, or other things. And especially for the convertible notes, there's what we call a debt liquidation preference. And that means, as we were talking about before, preferred stock versus common stock, and the preferred stock sitting above the common stock in terms of a liquidation event and getting paid first, debt sits even higher than that. So it's a rare circumstance where you will see, preferred stockholders with then, it's a special circumstance where you will see preferred stockholders and then also convertible debt. Usually that's sort of like an interim raise to get them from one round to another, an interim financing called a bridge financing to get them from one round to another. You would not see, or it would be very, very odd to see a situation where you got convertible debt, some preferred come in, and they don't require that debt to flip over. Why? Because the usual rule is sort of last money in is first money out, typically. Now let's talk a little bit about foundational basics and talk about valuation dilution. And I want to talk about this. Again, the point of tonight's webinar presentation is not to go into the nuts and bolts of a venture capital financing. This is about getting you familiar with the concepts that you need in order to get yourself to a venture capital financing. That is the path that leads to it, and it is a tried and true path. So one of the things you need to be familiar with is the concept of valuation and its effect on dilution. And many times, especially for first-time entrepreneurs, dilution has a bad connotation. And it makes sense, right? Because the percentage of the company that you own gets smaller and smaller and smaller, which kind of makes you feel like you're losing something. But big picture, if you think of the company as a pie, you may be getting a narrower and narrower pie, but the pie is getting deeper and deeper and deeper and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so at the end of the day, you're getting more pie. And if you didn't have that input of capital, you get limited. You wouldn't be able to grow the company at the rate that it needs to be grown at in order to seize the market potential that it has. So with that in mind, let's get two things of terminology down. Pre-money valuation. That is the value of the company before the next round of investment comes in. This is what gets negotiated frequently in the term sheet. Post-money valuation. Well, that's the value of the company after the money comes in. How do you get from P to post? You just take the pre-money and you add the new money, and you got the post-money valuation. If you know the post-money valuation and you know how much money is coming in, well, you take the post-money valuation, you subtract the amount of money that's going in, and you got the pre-money valuation. So oftentimes VCs will like to use the post-money valuation because they can say, well, I'm going to put in $10 million on a $30 million valuation. And what they're saying is, at the end of the day, they're walking away with a third of the company. Not walking away with, they are purchasing a third of the company. That's a little bit easier to sort of do the math on that than, saying that, they're going to give you a $20 million pre-money valuation and put in $10 million. So that kind of makes it sound like they're taking half the company, but really you got to look at it when the round closes. What's the value of the company and how much the company will they have? All right. So that's high level. Let's roll into a super, super simple example for two reasons. One, it's hard to do these things. No one likes to do math. And then two, I don't want to have to do some fancy math in my head on the fly. So let's take, and let me sort of do some more caveats as I did at the outset here. But let's tell you what we're not talking about, things that would make this trickier. So what would make it trickier is if we were talking about bumping up, taking a look at the current option pool and bumping up the option pool. Not impossible, especially if you've done these a number of times, it's easy to kind of do the math on it. But we started trying to walk through all that, I would lose everybody right away. What's another really important piece that we're not talking about or not doing the math on? Safes and convertible notes, which are going to be there. Okay. So we're going to fly through this because we burned some time earlier. We got a company that's got a pre-money valuation of $10 million. So what does that mean? Well, you negotiated your term sheet and the VC said, well, your company's got a pre-money valuation of 10 million. We think before our money comes in, it's worth $10 million. Okay. Well, you got three founders and they've each got 3,333,333 shares, or 33.33% of the company. So what does that mean? At a $10 million valuation, they've got, each has a stake roughly $3,333,000. The VCs want to take an investment of $3 million. So what does that mean? Well, so you do the math, okay? The numerator is the pre-money. The denominator is the number of shares that are outstanding. And we're not talking about an option pool here. We're ignoring that. We're not talking about the conversion of the convertible notes or the safes, because again, makes it figuring out the denominator trickier, but at least on the fly like this. So we'll see that the shares, that Series A round is going to be $1 a share. So founder A still has 3,333,000 shares. But now what we see is the denominator has gone up to 13 million shares outstanding. So the founder has 25% of the company instead of 33% of the company. Now, when the company first started, the founder had 3,333,000 shares. But the company is kind of worth nothing, right? So here, the denominator, excuse me, the percentage shrank from 33% to 25%, but the value has increased. Now, I'm going to just do two quick asides. If we were talking about a convertible security have been outstanding, then with a 25, for $500,000, there's a $500,000 convertible note with a 25% discount. When that converted, that note would have gotten 666,666 shares. Basically, you would take that $500,000 and divide it by that $1 a share times 0.75. That's the 25% discount. And that's how you end up getting the number of shares. If there had been a $500,000 convertible note with a $5 million cap, you would again take that $500,000 and you would divide it by the $5 million cap over the 10 million shares that are outstanding. And so, they would basically be getting at, so in the first instance with the 25% discount, they're getting at 75 cents a share. In the second instance, they're getting it at 50 cents a share. That's the mechanics of it. That should give you a sense if you're really interested to go back in and start building different models. But that's how the notes and the safes work. Let's talk about dilution just a little bit more, because if all goes well, you're not going to stop at your A rounds. You're going to need to raise more money. So in the interim, after you've gotten that $3 million in, when that round closed, the company's worth $13 million. But you hired more people, you started marketing more, you got more market share. Now this B round, the pre-money is worth $30 million. And in this case, the investor is going to put in $10 million. So again, what we're talking about here is taking the $30 million, which is the pre-money, dividing it by 13 million shares, because that's what was outstanding. And you'll see that the new investors are going to pay $2.31 a share. When you divide $10 million worth of new money coming in by $2.31, you'll see that the new investors are going to have 4.3 million shares. The total shares, right, are the founder shares of 10 million plus the 3 million from the A round, plus this 4.329 million. So the denominator has now increased to 17,329,000. Founders A stake has gone from initially 33% to 25% to 19.2. I'm not going to walk you through the rest of this, but I think you get the point, or hopefully I've demonstrated the point. It's math. The percentage is going to go down, but the value of the founders shares are hopefully going up. Now, all of that lead up has brought us to where it is that you want to go. So what have we talked about today? We've talked about formation, this sort of right kind of entity. And all this is at a very high level. We talked about some real key core concepts, which are tying all the IP, tying all the ownership of the ownership stake in the company to the company, so that it can grow and it's got control and rights over that. We've talked about financings. Okay, we've talked about sort of the typical mechanisms to get you from just filing with the Delaware Secretary of State to the point where you're going to do a venture financing. So with that in mind, let's talk high level about venture financings, because we've now kind of led up to, right, the goal of today is say how to position your company. So right form, right ingredients, and right path. Well, just as when you're potentially raising money from angels, okay, so this is sort of another axiom, truth that I want you to have. With your company, you want to have the right people involved. You want to have the right co-founders. You want to have, the right consultants. You want to have the right advisors. You want to have the right employees. You want to have the right investors. In one sense, raising some money is better than none. But in another sense, the right money usually has experience in the space, connections in the space. And so when they come to the table, they're bringing more than just dollars. They're bringing other sorts of opportunity and value, and that's going to help accelerate the growth of your company. That's true with angel investors. That's true with venture investors. And the other thing too is you will find part of the connections that they will bring to the table, if you've got the right folks, are other folks who invest in their space, right? So you kind of got a snowball effect going on. That's great. The sort of flip of that is that kind of once you get into that, we start working with one group in that ecosystem, it's quite possible that you will end up getting stuck isn't the right word, but let's say there will be inertia at the very least to continuing to work with those people. So, and those investors. And so that's not a bad thing. You just want them to be the right ones. So there are a few things that you should be thinking about. You should be thinking about your audience when you're raising money. Okay. So these are sophisticated investors who are building a portfolio of companies in a sector, a vertical or two. You know, their goal is to have this portfolio where a few of them are going to just knock it out of the park. And there are going to be some duds, but it's high risk, high reward, if you will. Kind of like you'd say maybe 10 years ago was a bad thing, like, you know, drilling for oil, something along those lines. High risk, high reward. And they've got a time horizon, you know, so their funds are set up and, you know, they're looking to invest over 5, 7, 10, maybe a little bit longer period, depending upon the way their fund is structured and kind of what industry and whatnot they're in. Again, in a certain area. So it's important you do your homework on these folks. Not just the fund, but also figuring out who's the right partner at the fund to make an initial contact. You can go to the right fund, but end up with the wrong partner. That person's just not specialized in the area. And so, you know, it's not a fit for them. They didn't necessarily know, would have been a good fit for their other partner, or there could be some other politics involved or something along those lines. There's a lot of information available. You know, and many times VCs will even just put it on their site. You know, we are looking for these types of companies. We are interested in you know, if you have the opportunity to pitch to us, you need to address X, Y, and Z. You know, if you've got a social media startup, you know, don't send it to a clean tech venture fund unless there's some clean tech play on it. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You're wasting your time. You're wasting their time. So that's a little bit about who they are, how to diligence them. Things to keep in mind: right investors will add value beyond the dollars they contribute in a whole host of ways that I couldn't even begin to articulate on here. The wrong ones can also be a bit of a drag on your company. Now, figuring out who the right fit is going to be is one aspect. Developing a relationship with them before you're looking to raise is also something that is pretty wise. And that's harder under COVID. And I see that there are some questions about that in the Q&A function. And so we'll try and address them a little bit later because we're running out of time here. But that's sort of one of the best ways to give you the best shot. It's still, especially on the early stage, Series A stage, it's a lot about the people just as much as it is about a particular kind of technology or a particular kind of play. So, you know, if you're a known entity, you know, you get a warm introduction, you're a known entity, they've watched you progress, you know, they've seen what you've done with the seed financing, you're going to be in a better position to get a pitch and to be successful pitching. Now, that's about knowing your audience. You also got to know what is right and what works for you. So some couple of things you need to do, right? First and foremost, what you're doing when you're raising venture capital is you are selling a piece of your company in exchange for money. I sometimes say your investors, whether they're angel or VCs, they're your first customers. Not because they're buying the product that you're ultimately trying to sell, but because they are buying the product that you have created, your company, and that you hope to grow, and they'll get a piece of the growing pie. So I sort of view that it is a bit of a sales process. You got to know what you're selling and what works for you and what price. So putting together an ideal term sheet, well, let me take a step back. First and foremost, identifying how much of the company you're going to sell and at what price is critical. How much? There's some rules of thumb, which are typically is kind of between 20, 25, maybe 30%. Could be lower than 20, could be higher, but that's kind of a starting point. And then the valuation, you can look and see if there are some comparables out there in the marketplace. But what you need to do is you got to go back to that early diagram where there's the growth curve, the revenue curve, and financings over time. And you need to plot out at those moments in time that you're raising, how much do you need to raise? How do you answer how much you need to raise? The answer is, well, what money do I need to do X, Y, and Z to get me to the next point on that growth curve? Okay, at which point the company will be worth more, the revenue curve, at which point the company will be worth more. And then if I get more capital injected, moves me up to the next one. You got to go through that process. That's about how much capital you need today. You need to think about it also for probably 2 rounds in the future to deal with the dilution thing. Dilution is not a bad thing. It's part of the way this system operates, but you need to know what it is and you got to have a plan for it and you got to be ready to be committed to it. And then it's not such a scary thing. And then there are other things that, we work our way through on a term sheet, which include some of the things we talked about: dividends, liquidation preferences, which we've talked about, voting rights, protective provisions. Those are those checks and balances, different types of conversion, when the preferred stock can convert, any dilution protection for the preferred stock. That is, if you do a down round, that is, if your valuation doesn't go up, if your valuation actually goes down, what happens? That vesting for the founders issue, which we talked about right at the beginning. And I mentioned that if you are not fully vested, if you're fully vested or you're substantially vested, you may need to reset some or all of that vesting. Who's going to handle the documentation? Is it their lawyers or your lawyers who are going to draft attorney's fees for them? Because most likely they will get a good chunk of their attorney's fees covered. And one of the big ones is the board seat. Are they going to get a board seat or just an observer seat? Those are the things. So we talked about today's I just keep bringing it back. Today's conversation is about how to position your company for venture capital financing. One, you need to make sure that this is the right path for you. If it is, you got to get the right kind of entity in place. You got to get the right documentation in place with the players. And then third, you got to get the right interim step of financing in place. Then you get here. Hopefully at that point in working through it, you've got a sense for, and running all those pro formas, you've got a sense for what the cap table is going to look like over time, how much money you'll need to raise over time. And this part will not be so scary. Now, let's talk about some common pitfalls just to wrap it home. Non-compliance with securities laws. So every company that is selling stock, debt, you name it, needs to comply. Those are securities. You need to comply with the securities laws. Securities laws are basically consumer protection laws put out by both the federal government, which is the division is the SEC that oversees it on the federal side. And then each of the states here in the US There are, of course, securities laws outside of the United States. So if you're doing fundraising overseas, you got to pay attention to those too. Big problems are, if you're running around defrauding people, you could end up in jail. Still a big problem, although more likely to happen is, if you make a mistake with regards to securities laws, the investor may have the right to get their money back. If you don't have that money, that's a real problem. Not managing cap tables, that is, not knowing who's on your cap table, not running proper pro formas, not having transfer restrictions in place. It's a problem. Napkin promises, that is telling your buddy, oh, thanks for such great drinks. That was such a good brainstorming session, even though this person has no other relationship with your company, that you're going to give them a piece of the company. When investors are making an investment, right, they want a percentage. They're going to put in X number of dollars and expect a percentage of the company. If you don't have a good handle on who is on the cap table, you don't know what the denominator is, so they can't figure out whether or not they're getting their percentage. It's a problem. Finders, those are people who are running around trying to connect you to money for pay. There's been some changes to the law in this area, but it's sort of still the exception that somebody who will get paid for introducing capital to companies, especially early stage companies, is compliant with all the securities laws around that. Obviously, if they're a registered broker dealer and you've hired them and they're investment bank, that's one thing. But outside of that, you need to be paying attention to it. If you're issuing stock and other major transaction items, you got to make sure you've got the proper corporate authorization. That is, the board needs to either meet or put together corporate resolutions. Other pitfalls are not forming the right entity. We've talked a little bit about that. There are mechanisms to fix it, but it can be expensive. Making sure those vesting agreements are in place so that if one of the co-founders leaves, he or she is not leaving with a huge chunk of the company early in the company's life. I have never met a founder who has thought they deserved less of the shares of their company. And so it's a real problem. I can't tell you the number of times people have come to me and, one of the early stage founders had left. They took a big chunk, took some chunk of the company with them, and the remaining founder or founders are unhappy with that outcome. Don't do this to yourself. Make sure you get vesting in place. Make sure, if you're a United States tax filer, you consider doing an 83B election. If you're outside the United States, may or may not make sense for you. Paying attention to securities laws is so important. I put it on there twice. Employment law issues, we're not going to have a time to go into that can of worms, but improperly classifying people as contractors instead of employees is a problem. And I'll just jump down here. Taxes, making sure that you've paid the right state, local taxes are pretty important too, especially if you're doing sales, you're doing sales outside of your state, and just making sure that you're properly paying tax to the entities for which you have a duty to collect sales tax. So that is about it. We're going to move to the question and comment section. We have been going for about an hour strong. If you've got questions, please use the Q&A function, and I'm going to take a look at them right now. All right. That one we have addressed. Can someone support themselves financially pre-over breaking even stage? If so, what are the ways to do so? So I'm not sure. I think this person's asking basically like, can you support yourselves if you're bootstrapping? I mean, bootstrapping is, so okay, what is bootstrapping? Bootstrapping refers to pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, basically not taking outside money or taking very, very little outside money. Look, there are lots of companies that get started bootstrapping. sometimes that happens because somebody had a well-paying tech job and put money away beforehand. Other times they work Uber or Lyft, sort of. And I understand we're in this COVID situation, so that's a harder thing to do. But there are lots of folks who do bootstrap initially and they dedicate themselves. And, if you can build a strong, if you can get through that seed stage through some or all of that is putting together an initial team and initial prototype, and you can really start to get some revenue and demonstrate some traction, and you get done that and you basically bootstrapped. There's a great narrative around that I think, if you frame it correctly, it'll resonate very well with the VCs. I mean, part of that is, look how lean and mean we can be, and yet also on the countervailing side, you need to be mindful that if you are that, if you're going to continue to be capital constrained, if you're going to be continue to, another way to put it is, they want to make sure that you will be able to spend capital when you need to spend capital to grow, right? So they don't want you to be too loose or too tight. I think if you can thread the needle, indicating just how conscientious you use that capital, what you were able to do with it, and then also how you have a great plan to use the incoming capital, in this round and in subsequent rounds. I think that can be a powerful story, powerful narrative to tell. How can I create value or interest in the entertainment industry? The majors have the main control of the industry for many years. This COVID-19 has really made us realize how much we need to be entertained. So I'm going to flip that back over to the entrepreneurs. I feel like there are a few things going on here. One, it's sort of your job to see ideas and opportunities, and then also figure out how to get the pieces of the puzzle in place to seize those ideas and opportunities. And I think also, when I do panels with VCs, they say the same thing too, right? They've got some ideas of what's going to be successful, but they're looking to the entrepreneurs to answer those challenges and those questions, to ask those questions and then also answer them. I do agree that COVID-19 has made us realize entertainment, and it's also changed the face of entertainment. As we look at movies now being released sort of direct to various streaming sources. But let's not forget that tech companies have changed, right? Have changed the face of entertainment, like Netflix and what Amazon has been doing. So there are a lot of opportunities out there. If I had a great idea in that industry, I would do it. How about changing to a Delaware corporation after we found serious investors? Too urgent. Again, so what I'm going to say is that question is too hard to answer in a vacuum. I would be happy to have a conversation with you offline. Again, it'd probably be a general information conversation, but I do save between the hour of 2 and 3 on Fridays. I'm booked this Friday, but starting next Friday, I got some openings to speak with folks who were in today's attendance and also who watch afterwards. But again, sort of high level, look, you can flip if you've got some sort of if you've got another entity, if you've got an LLC or you've got a California corporation, just don't expect it to be inexpensive. And don't expect that there may not be some tax issues that crop up that might make it extra painful. But like everything else, timing is kind of everything in life, and that's going to be very situation specific. Sometimes sometimes the company is so early, it makes sense to flip because it really is not going to be very expensive to do. Other times it makes sense to wait kind of until it's there's money, there's a new round of funding on the horizon. Is paying employees with equity instead of cash in compliance? Okie dokie. So this is going to vary depending upon which employment laws are regulated both at the federal level and also the state level here in the United States. And there are, I'm sure, employment laws outside of the US. I know there are employment laws outside the US. Just speaking at a high level about kind of what goes on at the federal level and then also here at the state of California, paying employees with equity is a no-go. You're going to be violating wage and hour laws. Sometimes we'll see people classifying folks as consultants to try and get around that issue. It is potentially dangerous to do that. I mean, not dangerous to your health, but may raise some flags in diligence, or may be an area that you could end up in front of the labor commissioner on. Not just to point out problems, but to also give potential solutions. Sometimes even just paying minimum wage in addition to equity is maybe the appropriate step to take. It sort of depends on the startup. Obviously, unfortunately or fortunately, there are a lot of companies that just do equity. Doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean you're in compliance, but it certainly does happen. Sometimes they get away with it. Sometimes they get caught and get into trouble. But here in California, you got to be paying cash and you got to make sure you're complying with the wage and hour laws. What are the guidelines for staying in compliance? That is beyond the scope of today's conversation, but just know, there are a lot of resources online, both at the federal level and then also at the state level. So, look it up at your state and look it up at the federal level in terms of what to do to comply. As a serial entrepreneur, how would you recommend on deciding what company idea to move forward with? Is there professional consulting available in the VC industry? So I love working with serial entrepreneurs. There are a few reasons for that. One of which is just entrepreneurship is a skill. It's an amalgam of skills. And so first time you do it, you learn a lot, even if you're not successful. Sometimes it takes 2, 3, 4 times to be successful. In terms of being able to pivot, I think, or figuring out which idea to move forward with, I kind of unfortunately only had the outside 30,000 foot view of that. I know that some of my clients really, especially if they've been very successful, they really take 2, 3, 4 years sometimes really reflecting on an idea and gathering information about the market and the opportunity in the market. But I think, that's one aspect, sort of really, they're better at vetting what the opportunity is going to be and what it's going to take to seize that opportunity. But then part of it also is really like, you need to be back in that right mental state, and ready to really drive. And I will say, I think in just observing my clients who have done it multiple times, in some ways it's way easier the second and third time, especially if you've been successful. That is because you've already got, if you've already made investors money, they're more likely to give you money again. The sort of a lot of the steep learning curve about how to set up a company, how to hire people, how to fire people, you've gotten through those things. Is there professional consulting available in the VC industry? I'm not really sure what that question is getting to, if that is asking if they will help vet your idea or not. So I'm afraid I can't answer that, but I think it's a little bit of a wandering in a desert process. And then I do think sort of exploring various ideas in that particular industry are the way to do it. And it's got to be an idea you're excited about. Again, hopefully you were excited about your first idea. And I think you got to get back to that place. And I'd love to talk afterwards or set up some time to talk. So we can kind of unpack some of that. We are pivoting. What is the best process for closing a Delaware corporation that is registered with the Secretaries of State of New York and California and has had no revenue and employees, and the company was incorporated in January of 2019? I'm not going to answer that because that is just getting, I don't know how to answer that without sort of getting into the legal advice bill. You know, high level, sort of typical right way to do that is, you know, get together the board and do what you got to do, and the shareholders, and do what you got to do to file a certificate of dissolution and file this final tax returns. Does everybody do that? No. But that's about as much. Again, happy to have a conversation offline. What about paying consultants with equity? I think, you know, look, this happens a lot. In some senses, it's less dangerous than employees. But at the same time, just because you call someone a consultant doesn't mean that they're a consultant. They could be an employee, and they could say, well, look, sure, we were labeled as a consultant, but really we were a part-time employee. So we're still subject to protection from these wage and hour laws. So, it you know, sort of gets done all the time, and it's a gradation of risk as to whether or not it's appropriate for your circumstance. When is it a good time to register an LLC? Is it when founders start an idea or when they're going for the seed round? Okay, their MVP. So the rule of thumb I have, well, there are two rules. One is, getting back to it, at least out here in the Bay Area, we have just a strong predilection for Delaware C-Corps. I work with other companies throughout the US. Sometimes we set up LLCs. But, you know, if you were to come in and we were to do the analysis and you know, and it looks like you're going to aim to be a venture-backed company, I would likely encourage you to think about being a Delaware C-Corp instead of an LLC. Now, that being said, if you've got more than one founder, regardless of the entity type, and because I don't know, an LLC may very well be the right fit for you. And there are some times when you want to do that, especially if the, you know, founders or some people are in the position to take in tax write-offs and stuff like that. Something you got to really work through. That being said, or with that in mind, when you've got more than one person and you're taking an idea off of a whiteboard, that's sort of my rule of thumb for when you need to be thinking about getting an entity, so that you can tie the IP into that entity, and so that you can document the ownership interest in that entity and make sure that it vests over time. So it would be, you know, when you're coming down off that whiteboard. If my startup is based outside the US, should I register as a Delaware corporation in order to be taken seriously by VCs in Silicon Valley or outside Silicon Valley? If so, do we need a physical presence? What constitutes a physical presence? Okay, so sometimes physical presence and doing business come up in, and I'm using quotes because that would be the language in the statute or for some certain tests. I don't know if you're asking about that. But I will say this. I mean, I think, so I do a lot of work with companies that are abroad and either coming to the Bay Area or they want to have a presence here. It's going to depend on each one of these companies. VCs are happy to invest in companies outside of the United States. Okay, so if there is a legitimate business purpose for being here in the US, then maybe you should get a Delaware C-Corp or some sort of other entity in place. If there's not, then you know, it's not the end. It's not going to necessarily preclude you from raising capital from a venture capitalist. I mean, there are VCs all over the world, so you know, that one could kind of go either way depending on the facts. With remote working and virtual meetings becoming the new norm, are startups outside the US or outside Silicon Valley able to get funding from SV investors? Yes, absolutely. This is kind of the same thing. So super cool thing is that, okay, let me take a step back. COVID-19 and the pandemic is an awful tragedy for the US and for the rest of the world and humanity at large. Now, without shortcutting any of that, one of the things that we have seen coming out of this is a lot more that the world is even flatter, especially as it comes to capital, than it ever was before. So yes, Silicon Valley investors will invest all throughout the US as well as throughout the rest of the world. And it flips and goes the other way around, that investors that were outside of Silicon Valley are now getting better access to folks who are here. And so capital is just flowing around. In one sense, the piping for capital throughout all of the world has been increased. Capital is maybe not flowing quite as much, especially at the earlier stage companies. I think there's been some of that has gone down a little bit, but I expect, especially in 2021, that it's going to be pretty robust. Is personal credit a factor in getting funding from angel investors and VCs? Will they run a credit check on a founder and officers of a startup when they're doing their due diligence? I have not seen them run a credit check per se. I do know they do a lot of diligence into who you are as a character, what other business interests you've had and have, how you've been. And so, they're very much betting on the individuals, the team that are working on these startups. And so if you've got an issue on the credit side of things, I think you want to work through that and be able to figure out how to tackle that, whether that is, because it could come up. If it's so bad that when they do a Google search, they see your bankruptcy filing, like that's not necessarily the end of the world, but you're going to want to get ahead of that one. I have an LLC that I bootstrapped so far, multiple offers from angels to invest. Do I need to switch over to a C-Corp? I think the answer is maybe. Again, there are LLCs can take angel investment. In my opinion, and in my experience, it makes things a lot more complicated. And then you got to do an expensive flip to get it over to a C-Corp. So, it depends on the situation, but I always, if you got a strong bead on where you go, I think, if you kind of start off a little bit of the path off the wrong foot, like try and correct. So as soon as possible. Now, are there reasons why you wouldn't want to do that? Absolutely. So this one's a little bit, but that's kind of what we would think about is timing. Do you have to be a US citizen or green card holder in order to get registered as a Delaware corporation and to get funding based on angel investors? I feel like I've sort of already answered that. So you don't have to be a US citizen. You don't even have to be in the US in order to get funding from US angels, venture capitalists. The trick is what you need to do is just make sure you're in front of the right investors, which we talked about earlier, and doing your diligence on that. Is a minimum viable product really necessary for an early stage company? Would it be better to get basically the user design before you pay for coding and development? That I think is really more of a business person question than a lawyer question. I've seen companies get funded with just sort of $4 million or whatever, just by who the team is and what they've done in the past and an idea that they have on a whiteboard. And then I've seen companies that are already out there generating revenue and it's hard as hell for them to raise. So it just really depends on your play. Are there consultants to help provide us to intros to Silicon Valley venture capitalists and to help transition to the US if we are based outside the US? Well, look, we talked a little bit earlier about finders and how here, you're going to need to be 9 times out of 10, it's more than 9 times out of 10. It's going to need to be a registered broker dealer in order to connect you to capital if they're doing that for pay. There certainly are a lot of incubators and accelerators out there. It depends sort of on where you're coming from. I mean, I know I used to do some work with Swissnex. So if you're Swiss, they, that's one means and mechanism. I know the Germans have some accelerators as well as the Spanish. There's a Spanish accelerator and French accelerator out here. So there are a bunch of accelerators. There are some others like Silicon Valley Ignite that are here that help foreign companies come over and suss out whether or not it's the right play for them. It's possible you will get connected to venture capital in the process of that. But again, I wouldn't necessarily, I'd be skeptical if you just sort of met somebody online and they said, I'm a consultant and I'm going to connect you to capital. That person's probably not doing it or may not be doing it legally. As founders, how do we structure deals with investors so that we retain control and can't get kicked out as a CEO, a la Zuckerberg or Facebook? Well, you got to build a super duper hot product. So, a lot of these control mechanisms really get put in place before the IPO, and there are, let me take a step back. So it's a very common question to say, can I get super voting rights and other things in my initial corporation? And so we frequently will have a discussion around that. That discussion sort of turns on, just how much cachet does your company have in the marketplace? By and large, I think any VC will tell you they want your legal books to be plain vanilla. If they have to spend any time sort of looking over and just checking boxes, that's time's taken away from checking out your product or your service and your software, and they're not interested in wrangling around with your legal books. So frequently, if we put all kinds of protective mechanisms in place early on, as a condition to you getting financing, they're going to have to be removed. So that's just wasted time and effort and dollars. If you do build a really hot product or service, then you will have the market clout to retain control. And so that's, I think, where the focus really should be going. Now I think that pretty much ends it for the Q&A. And look, okay, so we've got a question about big firm lawyers versus boutique firm lawyers, and is it worth the extra dollars to hire a big firm lawyer? Well, certainly I think it's going to depend on on the lawyer himself or herself, and kind of where they fit in the ecosystem. Are they interested in your particular area? What kind of connections do they potentially have? I never promise to introduce people to capital. I certainly, if there's a fit, I do make those introductions. Lots of people promise you that they'll do that. There is some real advantage to having a large firm that's full service, because sometimes when we're doing these financings, we'll have money coming in from, let's just say, China or something along those lines. There are rules and regulations about foreign investors in the United States. We've got specialized counsel who can help with that. I think there are a lot of benefits to being with a big firm, but it's really a relationship-driven business more than anything else. So you're going to want to make sure you got the right fit. And long-term, big picture, although legal fees may be expensive, they're just a small, tiny portion of the cost of what it is to start and then run and do your business, and hopefully just a small fraction as related to the actual value that they impart in your company. So I'm going to punt on that one and say it's going to depend on the lawyer. Make sure you got the right one. All right. Questions in chat. Is this being recorded? Can we access it later? Yes, I will send this out probably in about a week. Question about whether or not MBA pedigree can increase your chances of getting funded. By and large, I think it could help from the network perspective. You know, maybe some of the folks that you went to MBA school with are now in venture firms, so that might be helpful. Do degrees from top schools matter? Again, I mean, ultimately, the VCs have a fiduciary duty to their investors to make money on the capital that they are given. And I think, you know, you could be from not a top 20 school and raise money. That being said, if you are, you know, you may very well have access to a better network. So I think, you know, I'm not sure that would be the driving decision as to which school to go to, but I do think it behooves you to think about just generating that network sooner rather than later and figuring out what tools you're going to use. Is that going to be a school, or is it going to be getting connected in various events, things along those lines? With that in mind, a couple parting words. Today, we talked about how to position your company or your startup for a venture capital financing. We went through a lot of the real we went through a lot of the real core pillar ideas and things that you need to do. Make sure you're going to go on a venture-backed route. If the answer is yes, it's, you know, usually going to be a Delaware C-Corp. Get the right form of the company in place. Get the right agreements in place to document and secure that IP and the ownership structure of the company. Use the right funding mechanisms. And then make sure that you have done the planning so that you know what kind of capital you're going to need over what periods of time, so that you can sell the right percentage of your company when it's time to do a raise, seed raise or venture raise. With that in mind, it has been a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'm Jason Putnam Gordon, venture capital and emerging growth company attorney with Pulcinelli. My email is on the front of these slides. I'll email you next week with a copy of this presentation. I want to thank each of you for showing up today. I want to thank Jennifer for introducing me earlier, Rob for keeping me on task and helping me to unmute my mic, and Idea to IPO for having me once again. With that in mind, have a good night, be safe, and good luck out there.